Good evening to everyone here and everybody online listening. Thanks for joining us. We'd also like to thank Brewery Becker for hosting tonight's event. And we'd like to make you aware, it's good ale, it really is. We'd like to make you aware of a different upcoming event. Join us for Michigan Radio Trivia Night next Wednesday, May 24th at Connor O'Neill's in Ann Arbor. You can test your knowledge of current events for a chance to win some fun prizes and meet and mingle with members of our staff. You can learn more about it at michiganradio.org/events. I will not be there. I am horrible at trivia, so you guys have fun. We will welcome your questions during tonight's event. If you're here in person, just raise your hand and we'll come by with a microphone. If you're watching online, you can submit your question at any time by using the comment box, and we'll try to answer as many as you can. All right, that's the setup business. Let me tell you about what's happening here. For those of you who are old enough to remember, and for those of you who are too young, Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, all basically were established within a span of 4 years beginning in 1970. Now, last year, the Great Lakes News Collaborative, which is Bridge, Michigan, Circle of Blue, Great Lakes Now of Detroit Public TV, and Michigan Radio, looked extensively at water, drinking water in specific. By the way, I wanted to say we're funded by the Charles Stewart Foundation. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And we have been for, this is the third year now. And this collaboration started out with, okay, I've done this kind of stuff before, into some friendships and some real working colleagues. And we've worked on stories together. Kelly's worked on stories with Circle of Blues a few times now. We do events like this together. So it's really turned into something with a lot of synergy. I guess that's what the foundation folks like to say, things like that, synergy. Anyway, back to water. This year we're looking at the state of the streams, the lakes, the groundwater, and what we're finding is we've come a long way since the old days when rivers were catching fire because of all the pollution. There are some shortcomings in the different laws and in the administration of the laws, and we're finding that we're learning new ways to pollute the water, and that's not fun either. We still have legacy pollutants such as PCBs. DDT is still in the fish up north, and mercury still plagues us. Emerging pollutants such as the chemical group we call PFAS being discovered everywhere. We still don't have fully grasped that our sewage plants need to do a better job of filtering out more of the pollutants that our drinking water plants will have to deal with later. There are changes due to climate change and threats of old infrastructure failing and polluting our rivers and lakes. And then because of poor planning, lack of political will, and simple short-sightedness, there's not enough money to keep water and wastewater infrastructure in good repair without raising the rates a lot. And now we're talking about affordability, which has become a really big issue. Tonight, we're going to discuss some of those issues, but I want to introduce our guest. I'm going to start with Bonifer Ballard. She's the executive director of the Michigan of the American Water Works Association. She knows all things drinking water. And then next to me is Sean McBrady. He's the legislative and policy director of Clean Water Action. He knows all. And then my friend and colleague, Kelly House, is the chief reporter with Michigan Environment Report at Bridge, Michigan. And my name is Lester Graham. I'm with the Environment Report at Michigan Radio. Thanks for coming. So, Bonifer, I'm going to throw out the first question. That scenario I just described about wastewater systems and not screening out as many chemicals as the drinking water plants are required to, is that going to become an increasing problem for drinking water treatment plants?
So I want to be careful because wastewater plants are not my area of expertise. So just a disclaimer there, but water cycle is a cycle, right? So whatever we put out, we bring back in. I think the challenge for wastewater treatment plants is not only in sorry, let me start again. Not only innovating their water treatment, right? Because the idea behind the wastewater treatment plant is to get it as clean as possible before they put it back out into the environment. The challenge, though, is that some of the tests that they use don't detect things until they're already out in the environment. So there's lots of activity that's already going on about enhancing those tests, making things a little more detectable. Everybody's looking at different, sorry, I don't think I'm.
A little closer, yeah.
Okay. Everybody's looking at ways to improve the testing. But the reality is there are some chemicals and some products that actually get through the systems that have people. PFAS leachate ends up in landfills and ultimately will get into the aquifer. So if we're expecting water treatment plants, or I'm sorry, wastewater treatment plants to treat for PFAS, or in Michigan, actually, there's very few places that will actually accept waste from wastewater treatment plants that contain PFAS. So now we're paying to take it out of the state. That's not sustainable. There's got to be a better solution than that. However, we all recognize that you've got to be able to treat PFAS. Eventually, we hope the technology will become available that actually destroys PFAS. But if it comes out of the wastewater plant, it's going to end up in the raw water. That's what we call water that's not treated yet for drinking. And that means that your drinking water plant now has to treat for PFAS, right? So either way, somebody's got to pay for the treatment. And PFAS treatment is extremely expensive right now.
Okay, I'm gonna have you guys pick up your microphone because we want you to jump in here any chance. Kelly, you and I went to the Ann Arbor drinking water plant, and we talked about these kind of emerging systems, or emerging contaminants rather. They have a lot of experience in that. You want to tell us a little bit about what's happening at Ann Arbor, because it's probably because they get their water from several different sources, they have several different ways that can be contaminated.
Yeah, and we interviewed Bonifer for that story, and I think you said something similar, that we're going to pay for it on the front end or we're going to pay for it on the back end. And so right now in Ann Arbor, it's being paid for on the back end. They are, I think, unique, well, not unique, but relatively rare in that they get their water from an inland river that's pretty heavily industrialized in some areas. So there's a little bit more of a chance of, discharges happening from upstream. And they've contended with that multiple times. PFAS is a huge one. I think the Huron River PFAS was discovered by Ann Arbor, if I remember correctly, and then traced upstream. And oh my gosh, it's primarily one single plant. What are we going to do about it? By then, the damage is already done in many ways because it's in the river. So since then, Ann Arbor spent $1 million plus on a carbon treatment system for their drinking water system. That's not something that would have been required if there wasn't, contamination getting into the water to begin with. And I'm trying to remember, I think it's $250,000 that's spent every year on maintaining that.
Right, because they use activated charcoal to filter out the PFAS because it tends to trap it in the nooks and crannies. They used to use that same kind of activated charcoal or carbon in their tanks before, but they'd only have to switch it out every several months. Now they have to do it like every couple of months, and it's expensive. And then because it's got PFAS in it, it has to be treated a certain way so that charcoal carbon can be used again later. So it's not cheap. And frankly, a lot of people in Ann Arbor can afford higher water rates, but if some of the other towns are not that fortunate, they aren't that wealthy, and it's a real burden for them. I wanted to talk to you about the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is a lot of work like in Lansing, where they're trying to separate stormwater sewer from the actual sewer. They told me when I talked to them a few years ago that they were going to end up spending $5 billion so that they could separate out their sewage plant from their gutter, their stormwater, not plant, but system, distribution system, so that they didn't have these spillovers into the Grand River. That's great for everybody downstream. Now they're hoping everybody upstream, like Jackson, for example, will do the same thing. But this is a big problem everywhere. We're only seeing a few of the cities really tackle it, and none of the smaller communities are doing it because it's so expensive. Where's the money going to come from?
Well, yeah, it is prohibitively expensive for a lot of communities to fully separate their sewer systems. One example of a city doing it really well is Grand Rapids. Has actually finished separating their sewers. It took, 20 years? And millions of dollars. There are other solutions out there that I think, especially for smaller communities, makes sense to kind of start where you can, right? So green infrastructure is a really good solution there as far as, and when I say green infrastructure, planting native flora and fauna, making sure that we're able to capture as much rainwater where it falls instead of it getting into those storm sewers to begin with. And that can be a big part of the solution. In the long run, when we talk about funding issues, and both the issue of having to separate sewers and also the PFAS issue, which for those who aren't aware, PFAS as a chemical family has over 4,000 different individual chemicals.
I actually just had a scientist tell me it's because of the short chain ones added into it, it's 9,000 different chemicals. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's used in just about everything you can think of. Everything from your waterproof jacket to the hamburger wrapper.
Absolutely, and some of them are harmful in such small amounts. We're talking parts per trillion with PFAS, with the standards that EPA is setting right now. And so we're talking essentially one drop of water in 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools being harmful. It's going to take a lot of money to fix these problems. And back when most of our major water systems were built in the United States in the 40s, 50s, the 60s, we had heavy federal investment coming in to make those projects happen. And what we've seen over the years is this disinvestment from the federal government, a disinvestment from the state government, and then all of that money gets put on ratepayers. And when you have, and that's all of us, when you have water ratepayers having to pay, you wind up with unaffordable water bills, which we're now seeing in communities across the state. According to a study done in the last couple years, 1 in 10 families in Michigan have unaffordable water by the EPA definition, which is you're paying more than 3% of your income for water. So in the long run, we're going to have to do what we did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which is raise taxes on corporations and on the wealthy so that we can pay for societal goods that we all need.
Boy, that was socialism in a nutshell right there.
That's how we did it before.
I know. It's funny because a lot of people will bring up, well, we can't afford to do that. But there's always a cost if you don't. I mean, you're going to pay one way or the other. And it all, the people in Lansing, the people in Washington make those decisions. But when you're on a village board or a township board, you are too. You've got to, be aware that if you don't pay the price now, I'll give you an example. A small town in called Akron. They're all the industry and everything is really folded in that area, and everybody is suffering financially. It's really gone downhill. So you can't raise the water rates on your people when they're in that state. But now they're at a state where their water distribution system is getting to the point where it can't be repaired anymore. It really needs a big infusion of cash. And everybody keeps talking about ARPA money and all the big bucks coming from Washington for all these things. And it's great. It's a lot of money to put into infrastructure, but it's only going to help about, I'm going to take a wild guess here, around 10% of what's really needed. And that's the tough part. So you and I have talked, and Brett Walton, our colleague at Circle of Blue, has done a lot of work on this idea of where do we find the balance between paying for water and paying the cost of treating water. Where's this answer going to lead us? What direction can we go?
I mean, I think it does depend on which lever you pull, to get the funding. Yes, obviously ARPA is a shot in the arm that I'm sure Bonifer probably has some of the numbers in your head about, how significant it is. When it comes to these added costs of contamination, I think there's still an ongoing question of who pays in the end. There are ongoing lawsuits against PFAS manufacturers. Right now, local governments are picking up that bill to strip water away at the tap. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future when it comes to covering the costs of stripping away pollution that some corporations knew was happening long before the public did. But when you're talking about just water infrastructure becoming decrepit, I think it's multifaceted because yes, the federal government did spend a lot more on the creation of the systems that we have now, but in many communities, rates were kept much lower than the rate of inflation. Water rates were much lower than the rate of inflation for a long time. So essentially, today's water users are on the hook for bills that our predecessors unfortunately did not pay. And how you parse that, I don't know. And just really quickly, I also want to mention another part of the problem in Michigan is sprawl, water system sprawl. We have more water systems and more pipes and more everything else to maintain today than we did decades ago with the same number of people.
I just want to jump in here because I think we touched on something earlier that I want to make sure we kind of bring to the surface because it kind of gets at this funding issue, and that's the idea of planting flora and fauna to help with stormwater. It seems like a small thing, but the key there is in order to make all of this work and be sustainable, we have to actually think differently than we have before, and we have to look for unique partnerships that we haven't had before. We can't look at wastewater treatment plants or drinking water plants in isolation because they're not in isolation. They're part of the community. So it takes the entire community thinking about how that system is going to sustain itself in order to find the solutions that'll take us into the future.
So Bonifer, I want to ask you because I give you a really brief introduction, but tell us what the Michigan sector of the American Water Works Association actually does. Who are you?
Yeah, so the American Water Works Association is a professional society for people who work in water plants out in the water distribution system or who provide products and services for water. So our members, there's about 2,100 who are members in AWWA here in Michigan. That's about half of what is possible. So we're working on membership recruitment. But a large part of what AWWA does is standards. Technical standards. So in order to make sure that your pipe is actually going to live its full 30 years or 100 years, whatever it's called for, it has to meet a particular set of standards. That's a large portion of what AWWA does. A lot of what we do here in Michigan is training water operators. We want the most skilled and advanced knowledge people treating your wastewater, treating your water so that you get clean, safe, reliable water when you turn on your tap, right? That's our goal. So our role as a professional society is primarily that, but in addition to that, recently we've started getting into more policy. We've really started to tackle, I've actually been on a work group with Senator Stephanie Chang on water affordability. That's a big priority for our organization. And the reason it's an important component for us, the water system isn't going to be sustainable if no one can pay their water bill, right? So we've got to find a solution that works across the state. We can no longer be doing this piecemeal, one community at a time, and watch communities like Benton Harbor or Highland Park struggle to pay their water bills. We have to have a statewide solution. So that's part of what we're working on.
And let's talk about what you do. I mean, the Clean Water Action you've got your fingers in a couple of pies because you're also with Oil Not Water, right?
Yes. So yeah, with Clean Water Action, we were founded back in 1972 to actually organize in Washington, D.C. around the passing of the Clean Water Act. And, the Clean Water Act, I love that we kind of came together tonight around this being the 50-year anniversary of all of those things happening. Although Clean Water Act was technically last year. That was when it would have been implemented.
It's half century. We can fudge it.
Yes, we can fudge it a little bit. it's amazing thinking of the divisive time that we were in the early 1970s, that we got a supermajority in both chambers of Congress to pass the Clean Water Act, an act so visionary that it said they wanted all American water sources to be fishable, swimmable, and drinkable, initially by 1985. We're, of course, still chasing that goal. So Clean Water Action today is an advocacy organization. We have over 130,000 grassroots members across Michigan. We work in 23 different states. And here in Michigan, the main things that we're working on are, one thing is our overarching goal is protection of the Great Lakes. We are heavily involved in the campaign to shut down Enbridge's outdated and failing Line 5 pipeline.
And that's the oil and water don't mix?
Yes, and as part of that, I'm the coordinator of Oil and Water Don't Mix, which is a statewide coalition of nonprofits, tribal entities, and regular people from across the state who value our Great Lakes more than they do a Canadian energy giant's profits. And then the other big priorities for us, and our big priorities at the state legislative level in Michigan right now, are twofold. Number one, and these are both number one priorities, but number one is water affordability. Water is access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water is a human right. The United Nations in 2014 called the Detroit shutoff crisis a human rights violation. And yet we still go about business as usual, shutting off people's water because they can't afford to pay it. And the other thing that we're working on is polluter pay, which I think hits the other side of this, making sure, and we just had polling last week, in fact, that showed that 93% of the Michigan public is on board with making polluting corporations pay for the damage that they're causing instead of throwing that back onto taxpayers and ratepayers.
Kelly, other cities and other states are actually looking at affordability. Some cities are taking different approaches to dealing with this. So what are some of the options? What can we do?
Well, I think to go back to what I had mentioned earlier, the idea that, our demographics have shifted around as a state. People have moved around, but we have the same number of people as we did, I think, for the past 25 years or maybe even more. So one thing that the state is really pushing right now, I think it's complicated whether or not it can happen, and for various reasons, no community is the same, but is the notion of consolidating systems where maybe you have, we did a story in the Port Huron area, where the system in Port Huron alone has the capacity to serve many of the surrounding communities, but instead, because people have sort of shifted out of the city, those suburbs created their own systems, et cetera. Now you have that Port Huron system maintaining, I think, about a third. I may not be getting the numbers exactly correct. It's been a while since I wrote that, but a small fraction of what it's capable of providing and what it once did provide, while the next town over also has an underutilized plant, and the next town after that also has an underutilized plant. And all of them are struggling with looming rate increases to maintain these systems. So that's one.
But the problem is these cities are really proud that they've got their own
Yeah.
system. I mean, it's civic pride,
Yep.
And a little territorial jostling.
Yeah, and I think, but maybe the two of you could probably speak to this better than I can. Often in my stories, I'm just talking to people smarter than me, and then
No, that's all of us. That's all journalists.
But communities in some cases want to maintain some slack in their systems so that they can capture the next giant industrial. There's a lot of play happening in Michigan around attracting industry. One of the things they want is water. Also, there's the notion of your independence. And also there are practical realities. Sometimes while the math adds up, you have two systems, both of which are underutilized. Why don't they combine? It doesn't physically work for maybe topography or, a variety of other reasons. So it's not simple.
Somebody told me, and this was not a joke, they were dead serious. One of the things that's blocking consolidation more than anything else is, but our high school mascot is painted on the water tower. And they weren't kidding. It's a problem. And you understand, it gets back to that civic pride, that town pride. This is our place. You probably are familiar with this.
Yeah.
Tell me about what you know about it.
All politics is local, right? We all appreciate where we live. I was telling Chris, my new friend Chris, I was telling him earlier, I'm from Ann Arbor, and full disclosure, I can talk all day about water in Ann Arbor. I have great respect for them. They've done some amazing things in Ann Arbor. But I think that's sort of part of being a Michigander, right? We all love where we live, where we're from. We wouldn't be there otherwise. And so to ask some of these water systems who've been around for a long time, some of the water operators who've been there have been there for 20 years or more, to ask them to consider consolidation feels like giving something up. So the challenge there really is meeting each area where they are and having dialogue within the community and making that community part of that discussion about whether or not consolidation is the right answer for them. That's a big component. It's going to take a long time and a lot of commitment. But we actually think that that's what we should be doing, right? We should be having those dialogues. I know Eagle's been having some dialogue with various communities in the UP, for example. The challenge becomes an engineering one, right? How do you connect system to system? And what plant do you keep if they have multiple plants? There's lots of, and right down to the chemistry of the soil, all of that matters in planning out whether or not you're going to consolidate 2 systems or 3 systems together. So it's complicated, but we should do the hard stuff. That's what we're here for.
When we first started hearing about PFAS in the water, I think it was probably Rockford was first, maybe. And by the way, I want to do this because it's I'm sincerely in awe of this guy. Garrett Ellison at MLive broke the story about PFAS in this state. He has done a great job of follow-up on it, and I think he, Kelly, and Matheny at Free Press are probably my 3 favorite environmental reporters, and I just want to be like them, but I'll never be quite as good. Anyway, the whole idea of dealing with that stuff, and he came out of nowhere. We didn't know this was going on. It's been going on for a long time. We've got these other emerging contaminants that are happening, and we don't know what's not there because we don't test for 30,000 chemicals in our water. You covered the spill of the hexavalent chromium, which also was a big glug of pollutant coming at Ann Arbor through the Huron River. You covered that. Tell us what the plant did in preparation for that, or what could they do?
So the good news in hindsight was that by the time it reached the river, it seems like a very small portion, if any, was hexavalent chromium. But obviously, there were people on edge for weeks. And what happened is really strange and hasn't been fully explained how. But essentially, the report from the company Tribar, which is the same company that is responsible for the PFAS problem in the Huron River, was that one employee disabled an alarm repeatedly and drained a tank of chromium into the sewer that had been, it gets really technical, but they use toxic hexavalent chromium in their processes. And then when they're done with it, they apply chemicals that turn it into a more benign trivalent chromium. It was in the midst of that process when it got all sent to the sewer. So no one really knew, oh my gosh, how far along is it to becoming the not problematic thing? So we don't really know how that happened, but I think what it reinforced was an ongoing conversation that was already happening in Michigan around how do you put more stringent, consequences in place for polluters, in part to prevent them from being, maybe not having enough oversight at their plant that allows one employee to create a public health crisis for an entire region of the state.
I want to tell you, when I was quite young, I worked at a small village water plant, and I remember almost nothing about the chemistry. But here's what I can tell you. Something that reminded me, because we talked to the Ann Arbor water superintendent, and he was talking about, okay, we got a call from Eagle, and they said there's this glug of pollutant coming our way. And we're trying to figure out, okay, if it gets here, how do we neutralize that? Now, Ann Arbor has a PhD level chemist on staff. My village didn't have that. It had me. And so if you can imagine having to deal with having this chemical that you don't know much about, you're researching how to neutralize it. They actually have a pilot. It's a fascinating little project. They can basically take a sample of, okay, let's say it has that in it. We put it in this tube. Let's try chemicals and see what will neutralize it. And it's similar to this chemical, and we know that this chemical neutralizes that. So let's try that and see what it might do. But they're scrambling because they don't know how fast it's going to get there. They don't know how intensely the water is going to be polluted with it. Fortunately for them, as Kelly mentioned, by the time it got there, it was so dispersed. You know, the old adage, the solution to pollution is dilution. Not a very good idea because it only works for a short time. But they were kind of, I won't say they were panicked, but they were putting a lot of hours into trying to figure out, what are we going to do? That's just one case of a new emerging chemical. How are we going to deal with finding out about all of these? And that's open to everybody.
Can I just interject real quick with a point that hexavalent chromium, you know, the emerging chemicals, one of the issues with them is that they are unregulated by and large. So hexavalent chromium, we know is bad. Obviously, you don't want it in your drinking water, but the federal drinking water standard that we have addresses total chromium, but does not say how much hexavalent chromium can be in your drinking water. So it's also then up to local water providers to sort of self-police without a lot of guidance. That's also happening with a whole bunch of PFAS that is not yet regulated. There is no federal drinking water standard. Michigan, for a handful of compounds, has gotten out ahead of the feds going, oh my God, we can't wait for you. This has been a problem. But even those standards, you know, there are people who question whether they're strong enough, and they don't cover the entire universe of these thousands of chemicals, many of which we know there are documented health concerns about. So that's, again, another instance where the onus is being put on local governments to figure out, like, how do I protect my people with zero guidance? And as you mentioned, Ann Arbor, you know, is one of the best equipped in the state to deal with that. Many communities, as you have mentioned before, you know, struggle even to maintain staff, let alone have multiple PhD level people on staff.
I assume that Clean Water Action isn't that worried about pollution.
We're quite worried about all of these issues. And, you know, one of the big things here, nobody working at a water treatment plant, whether it's Lester or the PhD chemist in Ann Arbor's treatment plant, wants to be in this situation where they're having to scramble and figure out how they're going to deal with the big amount of pollution coming at them. You know, one approach that I think we can take with PFAS specifically is actually similar to the chromium approach, where we look at fluorinated chemicals and have, you know, we can have separate standards for different individual chemicals in the PFAS family. But if we take a cumulative approach about the amount of fluorinated chemicals that are acceptable for drinking water, that's one possible solution. Now, the problem again comes down to how to pay for it. The other thing about hexavalent chromium and tribar that I think is just important to raise is that hexavalent chromium is no longer necessary for making chrome plating. It is, however, cheap and readily available. So tribar using hexavalent chromium, and you know, this is the second major release they've had. They had a PFAS release into the Huron River a few years prior, and then they had the hexavalent chromium release. They've made a decision to preserve their profits by using a cheaper product instead of coming to something that's more environmentally sensible. They ought to be held accountable. And that's something that, you know, I think just about everybody in the majority in the Michigan legislature ran for office saying they were going to hold them accountable. So I'm looking forward to seeing the polluter pay bills introduced and passed this session. When we get to the PFAS, the PFAS issue specifically, I mean, there's just so many things that we.
That's
can
my
do.
boss, by the way, bringing it.
All right.
It's issues in ale.
Yeah, and with PFAS and so many of the other issues, and another thing that I'm always thankful for is that we have people like Lester and Kelly, Michigan Radio, Bridge, doing such great environmental coverage and keeping people informed. Because without that role of the media, and media utilities are waning these days. It's so good to have great reporters covering these issues that are so critically important to the people and bringing conversations like this forward.
Yeah, so on that topic, so I started covering environmental issues in Michigan and the Great Lakes region in 1998. And at the time, there were so many really good environmental reporters scattered throughout the state because the newspapers were strong and things were happening. A guy named Jeff Alexander was one of my favorite reporters at that time, and now he's actually with Mott, doing a good job there. But there's been such a real problem with funding good journalism that it's getting to the point where Kelly and I are really lucky because we're nonprofit organizations. Those who are for-profit are finding that they're completely dependent on the whims of the market to determine whether they're going to have enough people to cover the news. So I just want to say, if you have a local newspaper, support your local newspaper because you really don't want that to disappear. I mean, it's important because they can keep watch on what's happening at your city council and what's happening at your water plant as well. All right, I'm done preaching about that.
I'm going to jump in for just a second.
Sure.
So I'll echo the sentiment. I think you two have done a fabulous job covering environment. I appreciate that you exhibit journalism integrity to the nth degree. My background before I came to the American Waterworks Association is in communications and marketing. So I worked a lot with journalists, and there are definitely some out there that I would choose not to work with. So I appreciate that level of integrity that you bring to the process. I think it is an important component in this dialogue, right? These kinds of venues, raising stories and raising awareness about stories and problems, holding us accountable. That's part of the process. It needs to happen. It needs to exist.
If there weren't reporters, when Flint happened, it would have been a completely different situation.
Right.
There are a lot of reporters who were just banging on the door of the state government saying, no, you're wrong. You don't even understand your own rules or what you did. And it's people like Lindsey Smith at Michigan Radio and some others who really made sure that was taken care of. And that was one of the worst deals water deals we've dealt with since the 1970s anyway.
Right.
All right, so Kelly and I both have a tick about septic tanks. We've both done a lot of stories about septic tanks, even before we started working together. I know it's not about drinking water. You might have some observations about it, but
It becomes about drinking water.
this state is the only state in the nation that does not have statewide rules on septic tank inspections. I'm not sure what the solution is because, there's one that says, well, when the house sells, it should be inspected. Well, that's fine, except this house sold in 5 years. It's been inspected twice. This house hasn't sold in 30 years, and it's never been inspected for 30 years. So there's a lot of concern about how you go about this fairly. Every session of the legislature, they bring up a bill that brings us in. In the meantime, the flip of the coin is, if you live in a little town like Riverdale, for example, which is on a tributary of the Pine River, and your house is worth $25,000, you can't afford $15,000 to have your septic system redone. It's just not viable. And while I have a lot, because I grew up in the country, I have a lot of empathy for that situation. I happen to pay, in my little city, a fee every month for sewer bill, right? In fact, it's a good hunk of my water sewer bill. And so I'm paying every month to make sure that the water's taken care of. And people who go into the rural areas and buy a house with a septic system think, okay, well, that's taken care of. I don't have to worry about that. Like it's going to last forever, and they don't put any money aside for when it fails. So how big of a problem? We know that we don't have regulations across the state. The health departments, different health departments have regulations, but we don't have statewide regulations on inspections. How big of a problem is it?
Yeah, I mean, septics are potentially a huge problem. Part of the problem is that we don't have a lot of data. However, so right now, only 11 of Michigan's 83 counties have their own septic inspection ordinances. And aside from that, 2 or 3 townships have separate ordinances. Oakland County, right down the road here, which likely has the largest septics problem in the state, has an estimated 100,000 septic tanks and no inspection requirement, and all those tiny little residential lakes. So right now, actually, there's work moving forward in the state legislature to address the septics problem. There's been lots of septics bills before that have gone nowhere. Now, this bill is taking a different approach, and I think it's taking the right approach overall to what we need. So instead of all of the 11 counties that have ordinances have point of sale ordinances. So homes or septics are only inspected when the home is being sold. This bill would take an approach where every septic system would need to be inspected every 5 years. And so we know that over the course of a long term, a point of sale system can work to improve water quality. When Ottawa County, which was the first county in Michigan to pass a septic ordinance, passed their ordinance in the 80s, they were finding that roughly 30% of the tanks they were inspecting had failed. Now that number is down to 10%-ish. So they've made big improvement, but over the course of almost 40 years. And what we're talking about here when we're talking about septic problems is E. coli in our water. We're talking about beach closures. We're talking about something that contributes to the algae bloom problem in so many of our lakes. And in a Michigan State study from a few years ago, they looked at 64 rivers in lower Michigan and found E. coli traceable to septic systems in all 64 rivers. So we know we have a big problem here. And I think taking the approach of regular inspections of septic systems is the right approach. Now, the other thing that Lester rose, which is also an important part of the solution, is if you're that person with a $25,000 house in a rural county and you can't afford a $15,000 septic tank replacement, which they can be that expensive, we need to be able to have a program to help those folks be able to do the right thing. Septics, I think we really need to consider an important part of our water infrastructure. We're not going to build water and sewer systems out into the most rural parts of Michigan, and I don't think anybody would want that to happen in a lot of the rural parts of Michigan. But those septic tanks are still a very important part of our water infrastructure and something that we need, some public funding, especially to help both the health departments who are going to have to implement this and to make sure that, because the worst case scenario when a health department pulls up and the septic tank is broken, the worst case scenario is that they have to condemn the house. That's rare, but it happens in certain instances.
All right, let me argue with you on a couple of points. So somebody that had been calling Kelly about septic deal because hers was bad. It was on Lake Huron, right on Lake Huron. And she didn't have time to get it because she cranks out a lot of stories really all the time. So I grabbed that, and they're retired. They're on a fixed income. And I told them, it's possible that you could get a low interest loan if a program went through, just like there's a program for heating furnaces and energy efficiency and stuff like that, where the state will loan you a low interest loan so you don't have to do like credit card rates to get a new efficient furnace or something like that. And they wanted to do that for septic tanks. And I suggested to this woman that might be the solution to your problem. And she said, you don't understand. We're on a fixed income. We can't afford any new loans. And so there's, again, that whole cost to society, one way or another. It's really a tough nut to crack because this state is not a wealthy state. It's just not. It's not Mississippi, but it's not one of the wealthy states where everybody can say, all right, our average income in our state is 65,000. You know, we're not close to that. And it's a problem for dealing with something like that. So what's the solution to helping people who don't have the money to fix the septic and couldn't afford another loan?
Well, I think the system, the solution there has to be grants. Because there are going to be people who can't afford to pay anything.
But then the rest of the taxpayers that have to pay that grant, right?
Yeah, we live in a society. It's helping keep E. coli out of our water. And it's something that, I think we're eventually going to have to be paying for one way or another.
I want to ask Kelly, you've dealt with Higgins Lake, and I've done some lakes up north. Lake communities are looking at the idea of doing their own sewer systems and things like that, but that's terribly expensive, and it's a monthly expense that people aren't used to. What's happening on the lake communities?
Yeah, it is expensive, but I think it goes back to that point of, you can pay for it now, or you can potentially pay orders of magnitude more later if our lakes, which are, part of the economic value of our state, become algae bloom, places that are not swimmable or fishable. But yes, so in Higgins Lake, that is one of the communities that has a lot of tiny lots. Pretty much everyone's on a septic. It's relatively dense for an up north place. It also has some giant lakeside mansions where people can clearly afford some money, and some tiny backlots where people are living in, small homes that have probably been in their family for a long time. So the proposal there, and what's being pursued by local governments, is to create a sewer system. I think it's estimated to be $25 million, which can be a pretty hefty cost depending on who you are in that community, if you're all splitting it. And right now it's on hold because essentially this local level pollution issue, I think there's a lot at play at Higgins Lake. Like, it's interesting how the misinformation Facebook thing plays into a lot of these local issues too, with people just getting, recruited to various sides of the issue without necessarily having all the information. But, there was a recall effort there over septic systems. And now, it's been a few months since I've checked in on it, but it was sort of on hold until now they have to do a petition process to certify that more than half of voters in the two jurisdictions want it to happen, which is interesting.
I'm smiling a little bit because Northport and Leelanau County went through this whole same process, recalls and everything. Yeah, it split the community. I mean, that happened there like 20 years ago, and there's still people that won't talk to their neighbors because they're mad about the septic systems or sewer system.
And I think, it is. I know no one in that community wants, the whole reason people live there is because Higgins Lake is clear and beautiful and an asset. So no one wants the lake to be degraded over time. The question is, how do we pay for it? And unfortunately, for Higgins Lake, the conversation has been paused before it even really got to an answer to that question. So to be continued.
Like a lot of lake situations.
I really appreciate this dialogue. I think one of the ways that we can combat this kind of thing is by more dialogue about water. I think it's been invisible for so long, we've taken it for granted. What is it, 60 miles from a body of water anywhere in Michigan or something like that? It's been too long that it's been out of sight, out of mind. This is a real part of our life, and we're gonna have to pay for it one way or another. And these kinds of septic issues will affect drinking water if we don't address it. So it is a local issue, but it's also a state issue.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience in a second, but I got two rapid fire things I want to talk about real quickly. The first one is water use. People are really aggravated about Nestle and its the successor getting all this water, bottling it for a really cheap rate. And I always say, well, that's just a tiny fraction of the water that's used for irrigation and for power plants, which are the two biggest users, agriculture and power plants. And, the argument is, well, with agriculture, they're putting it right back into the basin because they're spraying it on the water, on the crops. Half of that evaporates. So it's not all going back into the basin, it's evaporating. And then there's, what is it? One of you is a better biologist than me. Transpiration from the plants, is that the right word? So that happens too. So that's a problem. So tell me about Nestle and water withdrawals in general.
Yeah, and I think, I'm so glad you brought up this topic, because I think that when we look at water use in the Great Lakes, this is a climate change issue, and this is a very important issue for us to be talking about it now, because people in California and Nevada and Arizona are talking about our water today here in Michigan. Now, Nestle, water bottling as a whole accounts for less than 1% of the current Michigan water usage. To me, and to clean water, the problem with Nestle and the problem with water bottling is that all of that water, both our surface water and our groundwater, Michigan, holds the public trust doctrine very closely, that our state has a duty as the public trustee of the Great Lakes. All of us are co-owners of the waters of this state, and the state has a duty to protect that for the current and future use of residents. Now, the problem with Nestle is they're taking something that is a public-owned resource, putting it in a bottle, calling it a commodity, and shipping it elsewhere. The problem here is privatization and commodification of our water.
Okay, but they would argue, and I kind of agree to a point, you're not paying for the water, you're paying for the convenience. I mean, how many of you bought a bottle of water at a convenience store? Come on, raise your hands. Who's bought a bottle of water at the convenience store? Most of you. I certainly have. I'll pay $1.60 for a 2 cents worth of water because it's there and I can carry it with me. So you can't argue with the fact that these people have realized that people want this convenience. So why should they've paid their $600 permit? Why shouldn't they be able to do that? The Eagle has already tested it out, saying they're not causing any damage to the water table. What's wrong with that?
Well, it's a slippery slope from that $600 permit and taking water and putting it in a bottle and calling it a commodity to when the Western states come knocking on the door, which is going to happen sooner than any of us want to. And, if the California Farm Bureau can afford a good lawyer, which unfortunately, I think they can. If the Farm Bureau out there can afford a good lawyer, they can say, look, Michigan is treating water like a commodity because we're allowing it to be commodified like this, so you can't discriminate against different buyers. And at that point, there's a chance, if they get the right judge, that the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution and NAFTA trump the Great Lakes Compact, and then we'd be left in a really bad situation. So it's not Nestle's use per se, it's what it leads to. I think that
this is supposed to be rapid fire. So, Kelly, the idea of water use. What have we found a balance? Do we know where we're going? Are we threatened by California, or what was it? They were going to ship it to Korea at one time, or
that was another threat a while ago.
Yeah.
That is an unfairly broad question to call it rapid fire. But
I don't want your opinion. I want the data. Right now.
So speaking to that issue, I'll speak to the Western, the threat of Western withdrawal. It's I don't know what the answer is, but I find it really fascinating to think about because the Great Lakes region has a legal, what's called the Great Lakes Compact. I'm sure many people here have heard of it. It prevents, in most cases, other states from taking Great Lakes water, but it's created by an act of Congress. Michigan is losing population. The fastest growing states in the nation are also the thirstiest. It doesn't take that much of a stretch of the imagination to imagine a scenario where the political tides turn and suddenly there's enough political support to withdraw, change the law. So that's...
there's a practicality in here, though, because we actually dealt with this story back in the early 2000s. And my colleague, Mark Brush, basically talked to people and asked, what would it take to get the water out to California? The number of power plants that they would have to build just to operate the pumps to get water to California and over the Rockies is just astronomical and wouldn't make it worth the cost. It'd be more expensive than gasoline.
Number one cost in treating water and delivering it to your house is the electricity to move that water. It takes a lot of power to move water. 1 gallon of water is 7.84 pounds, right? I think that's right.
Yeah.
Somebody has to check.
It's almost 8 pounds.
Yeah, yeah. So it would take an enormous amount of power.
So there's that. Let's go to the second one. And this one, I'll start with you. Cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, which I won't say it shut down the Toledo water plant because they did that out of an abundance of caution. Good for them, but it's been painted as this blue-green algae shut down the power plant. We're starting to see that in inland lakes where cities like Adrian, for example, are taking the water. They haven't seen the toxic cyanobacteria byproduct, but they are seeing cyanobacteria. So what's that look like for towns that might rely on lakes for water?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. First of all, if your community is experiencing cyanobacteria, do not boil your water. It actually releases the toxins. I think for water plants, the big issue is making sure that they have more than one source. Sorry. Water plants often have more than one source of water, not always, but often. So Ann Arbor is a great example. Their primary source is the river, but they actually have wells that are contributing to their water supply. So that'll be instrumental in helping address that issue.
Cyanobacteria.
Man, you're choosing them for rapid response. Public trust in cyanobacteria. It's a big problem.
Make it briefer this time. Okay?
I will. It's a big problem. I'm glad to see the money that was invested in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative was expanded last term and also last year. And then recently, President Biden got a commitment from the Canadians to increase what they're paying on their side of the Great Lakes for restoration projects, because really we got to help small farmers in Michigan have it hard enough without having to pay for some of these things that we ought to all be helping with to make sure that ag runoff is not getting into our water sources.
Which brings us to farmers. I mean, I've covered some farms. I grew up on a farm. Farmers don't like the government telling them what to do. There are some progressive farmers who are deciding, hey, we want to do this really thing because we want to make sure that for our future generations, we have good land here. And so they're practicing low till, no till and stuff like that to make sure that those things that cause cyanobacteria don't get to the water. What have you covered on that?
Aren't you planning to write about this pretty soon, I think? It's making me think about.
So give me some tips.
So, yeah, obviously the poster child for that is Lake Erie. There's a lot of ag runoff coming from the Maumee Basin in Ohio that I'm sure I just mispronounced.
Maumee.
Okay. And right now it is sort of a voluntary situation. Farmers are paid to participate in conservation programs, and oftentimes there's a sunset to that. And many times, as soon as the payments sunset, the practice reverts back to what it was before. So we've seen decades of effort in Lake Erie and not really any measurable change. So there are ongoing conversations around, does voluntary conservation and farming really work? Or does there need to be some sort of regulatory lever that, is more of a threat than a volunteer? That's sort of tied up in courts right now. Ohio is being made to create what's called a TMDL, which is considered the first step toward eventual regulation. But I don't think that process is going to happen very quickly. So this is a problem that we're stuck with probably for quite a long time that really we haven't, started about the.
This is the flaw of the Clean Water Act, right? I mean, it said, okay, if it's got a pipe, we're going to regulate that. But if it's coming off the land, how can we ever do that? And so farmers and other some industries get a pass on that.
Exactly. And I think that, sorry, I know this is supposed to be quick. I would say, two big things unaddressed by the Clean Water Act that are both huge issues for our state is ag runoff and its impact on places like Saginaw Bay and Lake Erie, and then road salt, which also is a diffuse pollutant that doesn't come out of a pipe and that is extremely hard to regulate, because I'm sure many of the people here rely on having a clear road the day after a snowstorm, and you might be calling your road commission if that wasn't the case. And yet we are choking our lakes and rivers, and it's getting dire for some inland lakes. So we have to have conversations about what the trade-offs are and what we're willing to live with.
Okay, so here's the deal. We're shifting gears. If you have a question here, raise your hand. Somebody will bring a mic to you. And just so you know, they're not going to let go of the mic. So just talk into the mic. And if you have a question online, just go ahead and submit it online in the chat, and we'll get a card written up and we'll answer your question as well. So let's, who's got a question? Nope. Catherine's back there. We've got one person with a mic and a lot of other. Yeah.
My question, it hasn't been mentioned yet, but the impact of microplastics in water. Can anybody comment on that, please?
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, right now, I think there's only 2 places in the state that are actually studying it. There isn't an active test that utilities are using right now to test their water. There are some independent utilities that have taken it upon themselves to test, but there's no regulation and there's no standard for the test. So unfortunately, it's one of those emerging things that we're gonna need to address pretty quickly.
Kelly? Any comments?
Yeah, I think absolutely an issue for our region. As Bonifer noted, not a lot is known. I mean, obviously there are great concerns about what it means if you have degrading petrochemicals in your water, but it's one of those emerging contaminants that's not regulated, and there isn't really a lot of public documentation of what the health risks are, which is the first step toward justifying a regulation if you're government, so that you don't get immediately sued when you craft the regulation. So lots of work to be done on that if it's something we're going to act on.
Sean?
It's a problem we have to deal with, and I think these 2 covered it very well.
So I went out with a group of volunteers at Duck Lake over on Lake Michigan to clean up plastic. And I thought, well, how long is this going to take? Some people were picnicking. They'll pick up some plastic forks like that. I was shocked at the amount of plastic that had been washed up as the lake rose and then went back down and left it in the wetlands of Duck Lake at the state park. There are pictures online if you want to look for my story about it, but it was massive. Now, there was a researcher at the University of Minnesota who is interested in microplastics, fiber microplastics in drinking water and other places. She tested drinking water around the Great Lakes, and she also tested water, beer from breweries around the Great Lakes. Now, they found microplastics in everything, but there was no correlation between the tap water and its microplastics and the beer and its microplastics. For some, the tap water had more and the beer had less, and others, the beer had more and the tap water had less, and they couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. So how many of you listen to Michigan Radio regularly? Okay, so you might know that I did a thing about cocktails with Tammy Coxon for like 7 years on stateside. I was visiting a distiller in the suburbs and was asking him, how could that be? How could there be more plastic in the beer or in the water that you use to make distilled spirits? He said, well, there won't be any in the distilled spirits, I guarantee you, but there could be some in the beer because all of our grain comes in what's called super sacks, which are made of polyethylene, and everything touches plastic before it goes into fermentation. And so there's a problem. The other is the Great Lakes have fibers of microplastics. And I was going to say, I hope that's not for me.
You've got a great news director, Lester.
So we're actually seeing plastic fibers in the fish. We're talking about microscopic size, but they become part of the flesh of the fish right now. And that's kind of shocking to researchers. So it's a major problem. And I don't think anything can be done except for stop throwing your straws out the window. Don't leave your plastic bottle or else, because we're going to pay a price for that. And in the ocean coasts, the birds are starting to eat that, and it kills them. And so we're losing a lot of birds due to plastic pollution. So my daughter, who's a bit of an activist, no fault of mine, started making me use stainless steel straws. So there are solutions, but we got a question back in the back.
The definition of navigable waters in the Clean Air Act is changing so that less water will be subject to the Clean Air Act.
I'm sorry, say that again. I can't hear you.
The definition of navigable waters in the Clean Air Act is changing. Or Clean Water Act, excuse me. Clean Water Act, so that less water will be subject to the Clean Water Act. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, navigable waters. So that's being worked on again. It's being reversed, but it's been back and forth and redefined. The Obama administration really kind of did a pretty crappy job of defining waters of the U.S. The Trump administration said you can't. There's no navigable waters unless you can float a ship of commerce on it. And now the Biden administration is trying to change that. Basically, the argument was at one time, if it's a water source upstream, even though it's not a water source all year long, it still contributes to the navigable waters, and therefore it should be covered by the Clean Water Act. But
yeah, the definition of the waters of navigable waters in the Clean Water Act has gone back and forth since the 1980s, essentially changing with each presidential administration, and none of them really having the same approach, which is a problem. And then the Supreme Court has made its own tests at different times, and some of their tests have also been kind of nonsensical. For instance, in the Rapanos decision in 2005, the Supreme Court essentially said that a wetland in Midland isn't really connected to the watershed of Lake Huron, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's our interpretation of the intent of the Clean Water Act is to protect all of the waters of the U.S., and we can't really do that if we're only protecting waters that you can run a boat through, because we know wetlands, et cetera, are all connected and an integral part of the entire system.
Bonifer, there's a saying that I keep hearing again in your industry: one water.
One water. What he said at the end was absolutely true. It's all connected. I can't emphasize that enough. One aquifer will eventually touch another. There's not a whole lot of barriers that we can put in place that are going to isolate a water aquifer one from another. So all the navigable waters, whether they're navigable or not, need to be protected.
Next question.
So based on that, here we are 51 years into the Clean Water Act, and it's being challenged and in danger of being gutted. Sorry, I'm getting feedback there. So. All right, let me point this way.
Closer is better.
So with the challenges that are happening right now, what can we do? What do you want to see citizens do? How can we raise the public will for better action on this? What's the call?
Okay. Speaking as a journalist, it's our job just to inform people. We're not calling action for anything. We're just telling people. How about these guys, though?
Yeah, I'll take that one. there's so many things that people can do as part of everyday life, such as the green infrastructure thing, planting trees, planting native plants, etc. Those are all great things to do. Those are also, no amount of individual action like that is going to be enough to deal with the collective problem. And our collective environmental problem is an environmental problem, but it's also a political will problem. And so how come it is that 93% of the Michigan public wants to see polluter pay laws and nothing's been introduced yet? So a critical part of this is holding your elected officials accountable. There's so many things on the democracy level we need to work out, such as getting dark money out of politics, et cetera, that will help. But, we need thousands of people on the Capitol lawn. We need people to get involved and get active in the issues that you care about. And check us out at cleanwateraction.org. There's going to be a lot coming up.
Kelly, I have to take a break. Can you take over for a little while?
Sure.
Lester's going to sign up at cleanwateraction.org/MI for Michigan.
I would say my response to that question is similar. My role is sort of to draw attention to the issues and hopefully present a factual narrative that allows readers to draw a conclusion on that. But Bonifer, you probably have more helpful information.
Honestly, it's as simple as being a pest to your elected officials, both locally and state. Be that squeaky wheel. Call them, email them, be annoying. That is the only way that they're going to pay attention.
We have a question from Bill online. Are we focusing enough on the impact toxins, PFAS, microfibers, and prescription drugs are having on the water wildlife like fish and mollusks?
I don't know if I can answer whether we're focusing enough on it, but I have reported on it a little bit. So I can say, yes, there is being work done to discern that. I think similar to the, for many of these compounds, we don't have regulations yet because there hasn't been a ton of health research done. And unfortunately, it wasn't done before these things were made available for public, for use. Even less has been done when it comes to fish and wildlife. So there is definitely a game of catch up going on. But Clark's Marsh in Oscoda is the first known PFAS site in Michigan, I believe, heavily contaminated from the former Air Force use there. And there's ongoing research there to discern what it does over the life cycle to fish and wildlife. And what we do know, in terms of how it shows up in fish is that a whole bunch of waterways around the state have it in the flesh of fish, so they're not safe to eat. How it affects their life cycle and their reproduction, there are, evidence is that it's not good, but we don't have a strong handle on it. Does anyone else have more to say?
I think that about covers it, yeah.
So you spent a little time talking about Nestle and their bottling operation. I believe they sold that company 2 to 4 years ago to another company. So they no longer operate that bottling operation in Michigan. Are you aware of that or not?
Yes, it's now Nestle. What used to be Nestle is now owned by, I'm forgetting the name of it offhand. Yes, Blue Triton is their new water brand. It's really like a, yes.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I had a question about the septic field inspection. Is that just if you're close to a water, river, or is this all septic fields? And if it is all, then why? Or, what is the reason?
So it gets back to that one water idea. Eagle tells me that their estimate is 1/4 of all septic systems are failing now. Is Joan Rose at MSU? Okay, Joan Rose at MSU has researched this like nobody else. She actually won the Swedish Water Prize for her work worldwide. And she says even the best septic systems, at their best, still release bacteria and viruses into the environment. And so a failing system is going to be a problem because that water goes someplace. It all goes downhill, you know, and it can take whatever was in it to begin with it, sometimes amplified, sometimes diminished, but any septic system is connected with everything else. So yeah, it's all septic systems are a problem. But lakes, because it's so concentrated, are especially a problem because it's got nowhere to go except for that one lake. And that's where some of these lakes are starting to experience some real problems. And you know, it's different for every lake because there are other inputs besides the septic systems. Some septic systems in some lake areas, lake communities, are in better shape than others, depending on how old the communities are. So there's no one solution or one problem that's endemic everywhere. It's a lot of different kinds of problems everywhere.
A little over,
There's a,
yeah, a little over 20 years ago, I used to volunteer for a Huron Watershed Council and gathered various insect species to determine the level of pollutants in water, because some are a lot more sensitive than others. And I was wondering if there's any sort of programs like that nowadays that we should consider volunteering for, or things we could do to at least help monitor.
Almost every watershed organization in the state goes out and samples stoneflies, for example, or something like that, and brings it in. I don't know of a watershed organization that doesn't do that. Do you?
Yeah, Huron still does that same program too.
So yeah, if you've got a local watershed organization, they're all nonprofit organizations. If you want to volunteer your efforts to go out and look for indicator species in their waters, I'm sure they'd love to have you.
Well, I'm Elizabeth, and I'm one of those organizations. I work with Moms Clean Air Force, and we are a mom partisan organization. And we talk with our elected officials as well with the EPA to work on these protections for our families and for our water. So I just invite everyone here to, there's an open comment period right now for EPA talking about MATS, which is the mercury and air toxic standards. We have 2 coal-fired plants here in Michigan that puts a lot of mercury in our air that ends up in our water system and our fish. We have 13 fish on our fish advisory. I'm just saying there's opportunities for folks to get involved very easily. You can do it online. And if you have any questions, please see me or see our organization, Moms Clean Air Force.
She didn't pay for that plug. I just so yeah, you mentioned mercury, which I find a really interesting problem because, you know, it's primarily most of the mercury that gets into the fish in Michigan is due to coal plants in Illinois or Wisconsin, but we offer our coal mercury to other places farther east. So as we're seeing many states and many utilities deciding, hey, this is happening, so we're going to end up closing down all our coal plants, we're going to see that mercury problem diminish. But there's still lots of other pollutants. It's amazing when you look, if you go to the fish guide, if you're a fisher and you look at the Michigan Fish Guide online about how much fish you should eat, you'll find that in every watershed in the state, there's some contaminant in the fish that you should be aware of, and you should limit your intake. And it ranges from old ones that are still around like DDT to PCBs to mercury to PFAS and on and on and on. I don't know how many actual chemicals that there are, but in some cases, some of these fish have more than one of these toxic chemicals, and that's why they have limits. So yeah, it is widespread.
Mike online is asking, will Congress ever include non-point source pollution in the Clean Water Act?
I'm not qualified to answer that.
that's $1 million question.
Yeah, it's phase 2 Clean Water Act is looking at non-point source.
Hi, Nathan Dufine here. It's my 8th or so, 9th issues in the AL. Been a Michigan radio listener for about 20 years or so. Just a couple quick rapid fire comments here.
He
So
really
Bill
likes
Gates-
Michigan radio or he likes ale. I'm not sure.
I'm former certified beer judge, so I do like ale as well. Suffering long COVID, so can't drink as much, but this place has great beer. The German alt beer, the dark one is great. Real quick here, guys. So Bill Gates said, he put his best engineers, said $50,000 to make a flush toilet in Africa to stop the various diseases and so forth there. He didn't know you could get a $5 bucket and a wood chipper and do a composting toilet. And of course, that's illegal here in Michigan and so forth. But that would solve the, a coffee can full of wood chips every day could solve that septic system problem. But of course, I do believe the septic system should get fixed. Congress should pay for it all over the country, of course. So real quick, right before I get to my question, I want people who are concerned here to come see me afterward because graphic packaging is polluting Kalamazoo. People are dying. Status Quo came in from out of state and they've done interviews. Lester kindly told me the Michigan radio did some interviews. My question's coming right now, guys. It's about farm field irrigation because a couple decades ago, I was reading Crane's Detroit Business. There's a Michigan company called Parjana, Parjana.
Okay, yeah, let's get to the question.
Right now, guys.
Now,
So they
let's
put
hear your
vertical-
question.
Parjana puts vertical pipes in the ground. They did this on Belle Isle, guys. I've been to Belle Isle, grew up in Metro Detroit, okay, live in the Lansing area now. So they put these vertical pipes.
What's the question?
Yeah, the question is about Parjana. So we're talking about horizontal drainage in our farm fields, taking it off to lakes and rivers and polluting it with all the excess nitrogen. Instead, Parjana can drill passive tubes into the ground that go vertically down and drain the excess water from farm fields or any kind of field.
So what impact does that have?
I'm
And
asking my guys.
Yeah,
You have to-
you've been given, hey, no, you've been given a lot of time. You never got to the question. I'm sorry, we're finished now. Okay, let's get the next question, please.
question, thank you.
Hi, so you mentioned earlier about the separation of stormwater from sewage. I'm curious what the current status is of the Detroit separation of that. I had a neighbor who was hired as a civil engineer, came in from San Francisco, was here from like 2010 to 2015. They never got the project on track. He's a tunneling expert, and he was supposed to be part of that project to separate that. They never got the financing. He ended up moving to Montreal to go work on subways. I'm just curious, has that ever come together? What is the current status of Detroit sewage, their separation?
Well, because of GLEWA has taken over the water, and then each individual town is responsible for their wastewater or how they deal with it. So in the whole metro area, which is really what you're talking about, I think, it's happening differently in different places. Some of them are doing a really good job. Some of them are not doing a really good job. This is an issue that vexes me because I've been in this business now for 38 years. As a cub reporter in Alton, Illinois, they were trying to figure out what this new mandate would affect them or not. It turns out it didn't because it's over for cities over 100,000. But I've been hearing from cities for such a long time. That was back in the 1980s. And we still haven't accomplished this separation because it's so expensive. Grand Rapids has, Lansing's on its way to do it. There are other cities who are making real progress, but there are a lot who are not making progress. And I can't tell you, maybe one of you know about Detroit, but I don't know.
I recently just happened to report about Detroit very recently because I was doing a story on the Rouge, and I'm gonna get the numbers not exactly right. They've made a lot of progress. They're not there. And I think I know the project you're talking about that was canceled during the economic downturn. Now they're on a deadline that I want to say is like 2038 or thereabouts to get the last separations done. But it sounds like there are ongoing conversations about approaching it differently and wrapping it into broader conversations about the fact that climate change is adding strain to the entire sewer system. So there's probably, it's not just so simple as separating anymore. There's like a bigger issue of how do we absorb more rainfall than anything was ever intended to absorb.
And this is something that engineers are having a real problem with because engineers basically go on historical situations to determine how big the next pipe should be, right? Now everything's changing. One of the really interesting thing is there was a big blowout in high water during the high water phase of the Great Lakes in Wisconsin, and they needed to replace some pipes in Wisconsin. FEMA would only put the same size pipe in. They wouldn't pay for a larger pipe because that's the way it's always been. They'll pay replacement costs. They won't pay for bigger. So it's been a really fascinating situation where the engineers are kind of like, what do we plan for? Because we don't know exactly what climate change is going to do in the Great Lakes region. It's a very difficult question to answer, and they're working on it, and everybody's trying to figure that one out. Okay, we got 5 minutes here.
A big part of the solution, I think, there again is green infrastructure. It's being able to take pressure off of the gray infrastructure.
All right. So you keep talking about green infrastructure, which is a technical term. So what do you mean when you say green infrastructure? What is that?
Well, the goal of green infrastructure is to capture rainwater where it falls straight down into the ground from there. So things like natural wetlands, putting local Michigan plants in instead of grass, for instance, in places. Rain berms, reclaimed wetlands, stuff like that are all examples of green infrastructure. And what it does is when rain falls, instead of falling on pavement and running off into storm drains, et cetera, it collects the rainwater where it falls because the ground's going to percolate better with those natural, with natural plants and everything there. And it takes the pressure off of the gray infrastructure, which is our traditional pipes, et cetera, to some extent. So that can be a big part of the solution. And the nice thing is it's also a relatively inexpensive part of the solution and something that every homeowner can actually help with.
I do know that Detroit is working on that in particular. So you think about Detroit, it is a concrete jungle, right? That's all you see for miles around. And so they are starting to talk about how to build in that green infrastructure not in substitute, but to enhance what they're trying to do to separate stormwater from sewage.
And actually it's being done in some parts of East Detroit. So
Right.
I've been there. So, all right, we're down to 4 minutes. We get final comments. I just want to make one point that we haven't talked about. I was just did a story on this thing called Forest to Michigan Faucets. And the DNR has this plan to get small grants out to these groups that do forest plantings, because the whole idea is they'll plant trees in an area where it's been denuded near streams. So trees do several things. Keeps the water cool, because that's important for fish and the biota that fish eat. It slows down the rain so it doesn't come down so hard and run off, which is going to become increasingly important as we have these heavy rains. And it helps filter the water before it hits some bay or a creek or lake or something like that. So I think that's a really interesting approach, because I like trees, I like oxygen, and I like filtered water. I'm good with all those things. 1 minute.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, forests are essential. They're an essential part of the water system as a whole. Forests protect headwaters in a lot of places. And, you know, another thing I'd add to that, species that existed, we've lost, I won't try to guess at a current percentage. We've lost the majority, great majority of our old growth forests, not only in this country, but across the world. And those are actually the best examples. But Michigan is an example of how we can restart again and have a strong forest ecosystem. We nearly clear cut most of the UP by the year 1900, and that is coming back nicely now. It takes time, but the more we can do to build forests and also to protect wolves, our apex predators in forests, which, there've been lots of talk about hunting them. Apex predators like wolves are an important part of that ecosystem as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge that real quick.
Modifier, I'm going to give you, and I'm going to let Kelly have the last word.
So we've talked a lot about water contamination today, and obviously the good and bad that we are dealing with today. I just want to make sure everyone's clear. We test drinking water daily for multiple contaminants. So I think there's a good system in place for making sure that the water that actually reaches you is safe. But there's more to do. The better the technology, the more we're finding, and the more we're finding, the more we have to clean out, right? So just know that there are lots of people involved in that process. That is, the people that work in water are very dedicated to making sure that what they deliver is clean and safe for you. And at any time, I encourage you to engage your water utility. That's what they're there for, if you have questions or concerns.
Can I speak to anything?
Anything.
I'll just speak
Of
to
course you
what
can.
has been
You
interesting.
usually do during our
Yeah.
meetings. Go ahead.
It was a terrible decision to pick me last, so I can just ramble incoherently. But
You've got a minute.
two things that are top of mind for me for coming coverage are, we're talking about water quality, we're talking about the Clean Water Act. Another huge pollutant that is not fully addressed and going to be harder to address as the future progresses is heat. That is a pollutant. It's considered, one of the pollutants under the Clean Water Act. Our rivers are warming with climate change. On a local level, if you are someone whose job is to protect that river, you obviously don't have control over our climate policy. So what can you do? And one of the few things we can do locally and immediately to address stream temperatures, in addition to trees, is dam removal. And so I'm really interested in that.
I'm sorry, say again.
Dam removal.
Okay.
Dams and rivers slow and warm the stream. Obviously, they often serve a lot of other positive functions for society. But in many, the Midland dam failures, I think, started a conversation for very different reasons around removing old and no longer needed dams in Michigan. So there's a lot of momentum around that. It's top of mind for me because the state just gave a whole bunch of grants today to various localities to do that work. But the amount of money that was requested, just to show you the scale of the problem in comparison to the resources dedicated to it, was like threefold. And this was the first year that was even made available. So anyway, I'm really interested in this question of what can we do to cool down streams, dam removal being one of them. The other thing I'm super interested in that's at the nexus of water quality and affordability and costs that we've been talking about today is continued outward development and how we manage what that looks like, given that our state is projected to lose population. We already are not doing a great job of maintaining the infrastructure we have. And as we continue to build it outward, not only does it pave over more, create more stormwater issues, it's also just a question of how are we going to pay for that and how are our children going to pay for that in the future? So
Bonifer Ballard is with the Michigan sector of the American Water Works Association. Everything can't be Michigan. Sean McBrarty is with the Clean Water Action, and he's got his fingers in a lot of other pies. He's a legislative advisor, policymaker. And my friend Kelly is one of the best environmental reporters. If you don't know Bridge Magazine, you should. I'm Lester Graham. I just want to remind you that the Great Lakes News Collaborative is a really interesting and innovative approach, getting these 4 different news entities, Detroit Public Television, Bridge Magazine, Michigan Radio, and Circle of Blue, all together to share material, work together, and things like that. And that's all made possible by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. We want to thank them very much. And thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for joining us online. We hope this was informative for you.
Yeah. See you at 9 a.m.